It was supposed to be an ordinary moment, quiet, controlled, and carefully choreographed within palace walls. But then, without warning, a single question shattered generations of royal protocol. Prince George, the future king, looked directly at his father and asked something no one had ever dared to say out loud. And in that instant, Prince William didn't just hear a child's curiosity. He heard the echo of a crisis that could rewrite the monarchy itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The room itself carried a silence that was never truly empty. It was filled with expectation, with memory, with the invisible weight of those who had ruled before. Portraits lined the walls like silent judges, each one carefully chosen, carefully positioned. Each one telling a story the palace wanted remembered. And among them, unmistakable, was Camilla's portrait, framed not just in gold, but in acceptance, in authority, in a narrative that had taken years to construct. It was meant to symbolize stability, continuity, resolution. But for one brief moment, that carefully built meaning began to fracture. George's voice had not been loud. It didn't need to be. The simplicity of his question carried something far heavier than volume and innocence that cut through layers of protocol with unsettling precision. Can we remove Camilla's portrait? There was no accusation in his tone, no defiance, no rehearsed rebellion. And yet, the impact was immediate. Because in a place where every word is measured, every gesture deliberate, this question had no precedent. It wasn't supposed to exist. William felt it before he showed it. A pause that lasted just a second too long. A breath held in the space between father and son. His expression remained composed, trained by years of public scrutiny. But inside, something shifted. This was not a question about decor. It was not even a question about Camilla. It was something deeper, something far more dangerous. Because what George had asked without realizing it was whether the story the monarchy had chosen to present was truly accepted, even within its own bloodline. And that is what made it so unsettling. Not the words themselves, but what they revealed. George was watching, listening, piecing together fragments in a world that was designed to keep its truths carefully hidden behind ceremony and tradition. Children were not supposed to notice the gaps, the tensions, the contradictions. But George had. And in that moment, William understood something he had perhaps been avoiding. The next generation would not inherit the monarchy blindly. They would question it. His eyes flickered almost imperceptibly toward the portrait. It hung there as it always had, unchanged, unmoving, confident in its place. And yet now its presence felt different. Not because it had changed, but because it had been questioned. And once something is questioned, it can never return to being unquestioned again. That is the danger. That is the beginning of unraveling. William's silence was not emptiness. It was calculation. It was memory. It was the weight of everything he had lived through, pressing against a single moment that demanded an answer he was not ready to give. Because how do you explain something that was never meant to be explained? How do you justify a narrative that even you have struggled to reconcile? George waited. Not impatiently, not defiantly. Just waiting. And in that waiting there was something almost more powerful than the question itself. Because it demanded honesty. And honesty within those walls had always been complicated. The air seemed to tighten, as if even the room understood what had just happened. This was not a passing curiosity. It was not something that could be dismissed with a gentle redirection or a carefully crafted explanation. It was a moment, a turning point, small on the surface, but with roots reaching deep into the foundation of the monarchy itself. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all was the realization that this moment had been coming for a long time. It had been building quietly, invisibly, through years of unspoken tension and carefully managed narratives. George had simply been the one to give it a voice. But what seemed like a spontaneous question was anything but random. Because behind George's words lies a history the palace has spent decades trying to control. Long before George ever spoke those words, the image hanging on that palace wall had already stirred whispers, resentment, and quiet rebellion. Camilla's portrait wasn't just art, it was a statement. a declaration of legitimacy that not everyone accepted. And while the public was told to move on inside the palace, some never truly did. And now, the next generation may be asking the question the previous one buried. Because portraits, within the monarchy, are never simply decorative. They are decisions. Carefully calculated, deeply intentional, and often quietly controversial. Every frame, every placement, every face chosen to be immortalized on those walls carries a message not just about who belongs, but about who is meant to be remembered, and more importantly, how. Camilla's portrait did not appear overnight. It arrived as part of a slow, deliberate effort to reshape perception, to soften resistance, to rewrite a narrative that had once seemed impossible to alter. And yet, beneath that carefully constructed acceptance, something never fully settled. There were conversations that never quite reached the surface, emotions that were acknowledged publicly but never fully resolved privately. The monarchy moved forward, as it always does, projecting unity, stability, continuity. But inside, there remained a quiet tension, a sense that some chapters had been closed too quickly, rewritten too smoothly, without allowing the truth of how they felt to fully breathe. For William, that tension was never theoretical. It was personal, deeply personal. Because Camilla's presence within the royal structure was not just a matter of protocol or public image, it was tied to memory, to loss, to a past that had shaped him long before he ever stepped into his role as a future king. And while time had demanded acceptance, and duty had required composure, acceptance and peace are not always the same thing. There are things that are carried forward not because they are resolved, but because they must be. That is what makes George's question so unsettling. Because without realizing it, he stepped directly into that unresolved space, into a fault line that has existed quietly beneath the surface for years. A place where history, emotion, and expectation collide in ways that cannot easily be explained, especially not to a child. And yet, somehow, he found it. Not through rebellion, not through defiance, but through simple observation. There is also something else at play here, something even more subtle, and perhaps even more powerful, a generational shift. Because George is not growing up in the same world William did. The narratives are different now. The silences are different. The expectations, though still heavy, are no longer absorbed in quite the same way. Where one generation learned to accept without question, the next is beginning to look closer, to ask why. And that is where the real tension begins. Not in what is said publicly, but in what is felt privately. Because while the world may have adjusted to Camilla's place within the monarchy, that adjustment does not erase the emotional complexities that came before it. It does not rewrite memory. It does not silence the quiet, lingering discomfort that exists in spaces where history has been reshaped but not fully reconciled. So when George looked at that portrait, he wasn't just seeing an image. He was sensing something. Something unspoken. Something unresolved. And in asking his question, he brought that feeling into the open, in a way that no official statement, no carefully crafted message, ever could. Which is precisely why it matters. Because once something hidden is acknowledged even innocently, it becomes impossible to ignore again. The question doesn't disappear. It lingers. It grows. It demands attention in ways that cannot be controlled as easily as before. And as the weight of that history presses into the present, one question begins to emerge. How much does Prince George really understand? He may be young, but Prince George is not unaware. Raised inside the most scrutinized family in the world, he has watched, listened, and absorbed more than anyone expected. And sometimes, children notice what adults desperately try to hide. Because George's question didn't come from innocence alone, it came from observation. From patterns. From moments no one thought he was paying attention to. Until now. From the very beginning, George's world has been carefully managed, every word around him measured, every environment shaped to reflect stability and control. But there is something about growing up under constant watch that sharpens perception rather than dulls it. When every interaction carries a certain weight, when every silence feels intentional, a child begins to sense the difference between what is said and what is meant. And George, whether anyone intended it or not, has been living in that space his entire life. He has seen the smiles that arrive at the right time but never quite reach the eyes. He has felt the subtle shifts in tone when certain names are mentioned, the almost imperceptible pauses that break the rhythm of otherwise polished conversations. These are not things taught in lessons or explained in formal discussions. They are absorbed quietly, instinctively, through repetition. And over time, they begin to form a pattern, a quiet understanding that something beneath the surface does not fully align with what is presented above it. That is the environment George has been raised in, one where truth is not always direct, where emotion is often filtered, where history is carefully arranged rather than openly explored. And yet, children do not need full explanations to recognize inconsistency. In fact, sometimes they recognize it more clearly precisely because they are not yet conditioned to ignore it. That is what makes George's awareness so unsettling. It is unfiltered, untrained, honest in a way the monarchy itself rarely allows. There is also the influence that cannot be ignored, the quiet, steady presence of Catherine. She does not need to speak openly for George to sense her perspective. Influence, in a family like this, is rarely about direct instruction. It is about tone, about feeling, about the subtle ways certain topics are approached or avoided. George has grown up close enough to sense what is comfortable and what is not. And that understanding shapes him in ways that cannot easily be controlled or predicted. But perhaps the most significant factor is the growing gap between what George is told and what he experiences. Official narratives are polished, consistent, designed to provide clarity and certainty. Yet real life, even within palace walls, is rarely that simple. There are contradictions. There are tensions that surface in fleeting moments before being quickly covered again. And for a child who is paying attention, those contradictions do not disappear. They accumulate. They demand interpretation. So George begins to form his own understanding, not through rebellion, not through defiance, but through quiet observation. He connects what he sees with what he feels, what he hears with what is left unsaid. And slowly, without anyone fully realizing it, he starts to build a perspective that is entirely his own. One that is not bound by the same expectations that shaped the generation before him. One that is willing to question, even if that questioning comes in the form of something as simple as a single sentence. And that is where the real shift begins. Because this is no longer just about a portrait, or a moment, or even a single question. It is about a mindset that is beginning to take shape within the very person who represents the future of the monarchy. A mindset that may not accept things simply because they have always been that way. A mindset that may seek clarity where there has only ever been quiet acceptance. Which means this moment is not isolated. It is a glimpse. A warning, perhaps, of what is to come. Because if George is already seeing beyond the surface now, then what happens when he begins to ask even more difficult questions? What happens when observation turns into understanding, and understanding turns into challenge? But if George is beginning to form his own understanding, then William faces a question far more dangerous. How does a father answer when the truth is complicated? For a moment, time stood still. Not because William didn't have an answer, but because every possible answer came with consequences. As a father, he wanted to protect his son. As a future king, he had to protect the institution. And as a son of Diana, he carried a past that still hasn't fully healed. So when George asked that question, William wasn't just responding to a child. He was confronting his own unresolved history. It all collided in that single pause. Not dramatic on the surface, not visible to anyone outside that space, but internally, overwhelming. Because William has spent his entire life learning how to navigate two identities that rarely align. One demands honesty, vulnerability, emotional clarity. The other demands control, restraint, silence. And in that moment, those two identities stood in direct opposition, each pulling him toward a different answer. As a father, the instinct is simple. You explain. You reassure. You create clarity where confusion exists. You protect your child from the weight of things they are not yet ready to carry. But this was not a simple question, and there was no simple explanation. Because any answer that even approached honesty would open a door into a past filled with pain, conflict, and choices that cannot be neatly explained to a child who is still trying to understand the world in clear lines of right and wrong. And yet, as a future king, William knows something else entirely. The monarchy survives on consistency, on carefully maintained narratives that cannot afford to fracture under scrutiny, especially not from within. Every word he speaks, even in private, carries potential consequences. Because in this world, private moments have a way of becoming public truths, and once something is acknowledged, it cannot be taken back. That is the burden he carries, not just what to say, but what must never be said. But beneath both of those roles lies something even more complicated. The son. The memory. The part of William that has never fully separated from the emotional impact of Diana's absence. That history is not abstract for him. It is not distant. It is something he has lived with, something that shaped his understanding of loyalty, of love, of loss. And Camilla's place within that story is not something that can be reduced to a simple explanation, not even now, after years of public acceptance and carefully managed unity. That is why the question lingers in a way that feels almost unbearable, because it forces William to confront something he has learned to manage rather than resolve. It asks him, in the simplest possible terms, to define something that has never been simple for him. And there is a quiet fear in that, a fear of saying too much, of revealing something that cannot be easily contained once spoken. But there is also a different fear, equally powerful. The fear of saying too little, of offering a response so controlled, so distant, that George begins to sense the same contradictions William once felt himself. And that is where the real tension lies. Not in the question itself, but in its potential consequences. Because whatever William says or doesn't say will shape how George understands not just this moment, but the people involved in it. It will influence how he sees his family, how he interprets history, how he begins to define truth within a system that often avoids it. And William knows this. He feels it in the weight of the silence between them. So he hesitates, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness. Because this is not just a conversation, it is a turning point. A moment where the personal and the institutional collide in a way that cannot be separated, no matter how carefully he tries to navigate it. And in that hesitation, something becomes clear. This is not a problem that can be solved with a single answer. It is something that will follow them, shape them, evolve with them over time. George is still waiting, still watching, and William understands that what happens next matters more than it seems. Not because of the words themselves, but because of what they represent. The beginning of understanding. The beginning of questioning. The beginning of something that may one day become far more difficult to contain. And yet, William isn't the only one whose presence lingers in that room. Because even in silence, another figure's shadow still dominates the monarchy. She isn't in the room. She isn't on the wall. And yet, she's everywhere. Princess Diana's absence has never truly been an absence, it's been a presence the monarchy could never replace. And perhaps, without even realizing it, George's question wasn't just about Camilla. It was about someone else. Someone whose memory still shapes how the next king and the next generation see everything. Because Diana was never just a figure in history. She became something far more powerful than that, an emotional reference point that refuses to fade, no matter how carefully time attempts to soften it. For William, she is not a distant memory shaped by public narratives. She is personal, immediate. A voice that lingers in quiet moments, a standard that cannot be replaced, a loss that never fully resolves. And whether he speaks of it or not, that presence follows him into every decision, every silence, every carefully chosen word. That is what makes this moment so heavy. Because when George asked his question, he unknowingly touched something far deeper than a portrait on a wall. He stepped into a legacy that has never been fully reconciled. A legacy where love, loss, loyalty, and public expectation exist in constant tension. And in that space, Diana's absence becomes louder than any explanation could ever be. There is also a contrast that cannot be ignored. Not openly, not directly, but it exists in the background of everything. The difference in how Diana was seen, how she was felt, how she connected not just with the public, but within the emotional core of the family itself. And while time has moved forward, while roles have shifted and acceptance has been carefully constructed, that contrast has never completely disappeared. It lingers in perception, in memory, in the quiet comparisons no one openly acknowledges but many still feel. George may not fully understand the details, but he understands the feeling. Because stories have a way of passing down, even when they are not formally told. Through tone, through emotion, through the way certain names carry a different weight when spoken. He has grown up in an environment where Diana is not just remembered, she is felt. And that emotional inheritance shapes him in ways that are subtle but undeniable. It is not about choosing sides. It is not about forming judgments. It is about alignment, about the quiet, instinctive way a child connects with what feels genuine, what feels unresolved, what feels significant. And George, whether anyone intended it or not, has inherited not just a position within the monarchy, but the emotional echoes that come with it. For William, this creates a conflict that cannot easily be expressed. Because how do you explain a past that is still emotionally present? How do you honor one legacy while maintaining another? The monarchy demands balance, demands forward movement, demands unity. But emotions do not always follow those same rules. They resist neat conclusions. They linger in spaces where logic cannot fully contain them. And perhaps that is what George sensed. Not the specifics, not the history in its full complexity, but the emotional undercurrent that runs beneath it all. The sense that something important exists just beyond what is being said. That something is being carried forward quietly, without full explanation. And in asking his question, he brought that feeling into the open, even if he could not yet define it. This is what makes the moment so haunting, because it is not just about what is visible, but about what is felt. Not just about the present, but about the way the past continues to shape it in ways that cannot be easily controlled. And once that connection is made, once a new generation begins to feel what the previous one has carried, it changes everything. Slowly, quietly, but undeniably. Because now, it is no longer just William who holds that memory. It is beginning to pass forward, to take root in someone who will one day define the future of the monarchy. And that transition, that quiet transfer of emotional understanding, is something no institution can fully manage. But while the past lingers in memory, the present is far less forgiving, because every word spoken inside those walls carries consequences beyond them. In the royal palace, nothing is ever truly private. Conversations are noted, reactions are observed, and even the smallest moment can ripple outward into something far larger. So when George asked that question, it didn't just stay between father and son, because within minutes, whispers began to move. And what started as a quiet exchange suddenly became something the entire institution might have to confront. That is the reality behind the polished image. Every movement within those walls exists within a system of awareness that never fully switches off, not out of malice, but out of design. The monarchy survives through control of narrative, of perception, of timing, and that level of control requires constant observation. Staff members are trained to notice shifts in tone, changes in behavior, moments that feel different, because those moments often signal something larger beneath the surface. And this was one of those moments. Subtle, contained, but unmistakable. A pause that lasted too long. A silence that felt heavier than it should have been. It didn't take raised voices or visible tension to draw attention. In fact, it was the opposite, the restraint, the careful stillness that made it stand out. Because in a place where everything is carefully managed, even the smallest disruption becomes significant. From there, it begins the way it always does. Quietly. Indirectly. A glance exchanged. A note made. A conversation revisited in hushed tones. Framed not as gossip, but as concern. Something unusual happened. A question was asked. There was hesitation. No details at first, just fragments. But fragments have a way of connecting. And once they begin to form a pattern, they become something much harder to contain. The palace has always relied on its ability to manage these moments before they grow. To interpret them, reshape them, ensure that what reaches the outside world aligns with the image it needs to maintain. But that process depends on one critical factor: timing. The faster something is contained, the easier it is to control. The longer it lingers, the more unpredictable it becomes. And this moment, this question, was already beginning to linger. Because there is something uniquely difficult about containing a question. Especially one that touches on something so deeply embedded within the monarchy's structure. You can manage actions. You can redirect behavior. But a question? A question suggests doubt. And doubt, once it exists, does not disappear simply because it is ignored. It spreads. Quietly. Subtly. Moving from one mind to another, growing stronger each time it is reconsidered. And now, the question is no longer confined to George. It exists in the space around it, in the awareness of those who sensed it, even without hearing the exact words. It becomes part of the atmosphere, part of the underlying tension that begins to shift how people think, how they interpret, how they anticipate what might come next. Because if the future king is already asking questions like this, what does that mean for the future itself? That is where the real pressure begins. Not in the initial moment, but in its aftermath, in the realization that something small has the potential to become something much larger if not handled carefully. The monarchy is built on continuity, on the idea that each generation carries forward what came before without disruption. But this feels like the beginning of a disruption. And so the instinct to contain it intensifies. Conversations become more deliberate. Attention sharpens. There is an unspoken urgency to understand exactly what was said, how it was said, what it might mean. Because once clarity is achieved, action can follow. That is how the system protects itself by moving quickly, quietly, decisively. But even as that process begins, there is a growing awareness that this may not be something that can be easily managed. Because this is not just about perception. It is about perspective. And perspective, especially when it belongs to someone like George, cannot simply be adjusted or redirected without consequence. Which raises a far more unsettling possibility. What if this moment doesn't stay contained? What if it moves beyond these walls? Beyond controlled narratives? Beyond the careful structure that has held everything together for so long? Because once something like this reaches the outside world, it no longer belongs to the palace. It becomes something else entirely. And as whispers grow louder, one question begins to take shape beyond the palace walls. What happens if this moment doesn't stay hidden? It may seem like a small moment, a child asking about a portrait. But in a monarchy built on symbolism, nothing is ever small, because if the future king is already questioning the past, then the foundation itself may be shifting. And what begins as a private doubt could evolve into a public redefinition of legacy, power, and identity within the royal family. Because the monarchy does not rely on force. It relies on meaning. On symbols that carry weight far beyond their physical form. A portrait is never just an image, it is a declaration. It tells the world who belongs, who is honored, who is woven into the official story that will be passed down. And when that symbol is questioned, even quietly, it is not the object that is being challenged, it is the meaning behind it. That is why this moment carries such significance. George is not just a child in this context, he is the future of the institution itself. And the way he interprets these symbols today will shape how he defines them tomorrow. If he is already questioning what is presented as fixed, as unquestionable, then the idea of permanence begins to weaken. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but enough to matter. Enough to signal that something is shifting beneath the surface. And that shift is not external. It is not coming from public pressure or media scrutiny or changing societal expectations. It is coming from within, from the very person who is meant to inherit and preserve the system exactly as it stands. That is what makes it so powerful and so unpredictable. Because change imposed from the outside can be resisted, managed, delayed. But change that begins internally, that is far more difficult to control. There is also the question of time. Moments like this do not remain isolated. They evolve. They resurface. What begins as a simple curiosity can grow into a deeper understanding, and that understanding can eventually lead to decisions. George may not act on this question now, or even soon, but the fact that he has asked it means it exists. It has taken root, and ideas once planted rarely disappear without leaving some kind of impact behind. This is where the fragility of the monarchy's narrative becomes most visible. It has always depended on continuity, the idea that each generation accepts the structure they inherit and carries it forward without disruption. But what happens when that acceptance is no longer automatic? What happens when the next generation begins to engage with that structure critically, rather than simply upholding it? That is not just a shift in perspective, it is a shift in foundation. And yet, this is not necessarily a rebellion. It is something quieter, more subtle, a gradual evolution of thought, shaped by a world that is already different from the one that came before. George is growing up in an era where questions are not discouraged in the same way they once were, where transparency holds a different kind of value. And even within the controlled environment of the monarchy, those broader shifts cannot be completely kept out. So the tension builds not explosively, not dramatically, but steadily, between what has always been and what might begin to change, between tradition that demands stability and a mindset that leans toward understanding. And at the center of that tension is a single, deceptively simple question that refuses to lose its weight. Because this moment is not just about what George asked, it is about what that question represents. A willingness to look beyond what is presented. A readiness to notice what feels unresolved, and perhaps eventually a desire to address it. And if that is the case, then this is only the beginning. Not of a sudden transformation, but of a gradual, inevitable shift that will unfold over time. One that may redefine not just how the monarchy is seen, but how it sees itself. But before any future unfolds, there is one final layer to this story. The answer William ultimately chose to give. In the end, it wasn't what William said that mattered most, it was what he didn't say. Because sometimes, silence carries more truth than words ever could. And in that moment, as George waited for an answer, something passed between them. Something unspoken, but deeply understood. A realization, a recognition, and perhaps the beginning of a shift no one is fully prepared for. William's response, when it finally came, was careful, measured, not rushed, not reactive, but constructed in a way that revealed just how much thought stood behind even the simplest choice of words. He did not dismiss the question outright, but neither did he fully engage with it. Instead, he moved around it, shaping his answer with the precision of someone who understands that every sentence can carry consequences far beyond the moment it is spoken. And yet, in that careful balance, something remained untouched. Something deliberately left unsaid. Because silence, in a situation like this, is not absence. It is presence. It is a boundary. A signal that there are layers beneath the surface that cannot be easily explained, not yet. Perhaps not ever in full. And William knows this better than anyone. He has lived within those layers, learned to navigate them, learned when to speak and when to hold back. But what makes this moment different is not the silence itself, it is who is witnessing it. George is not just hearing words. He is interpreting everything around them. The pause before the answer. The tone in which it is delivered. The subtle shift that suggests there is more beneath what is being said. And in that awareness, something changes. Because children do not need complete explanations to recognize complexity. They feel it. They sense when something is being softened, when something is being protected, when something is being left incomplete. And that is exactly what happens here. William offers enough to guide, but not enough to fully satisfy. Enough to maintain structure, but not enough to remove the question entirely. It is a response designed to preserve balance, to protect both the institution and the emotional space of his son. But in doing so, it also creates something else: ambiguity. And ambiguity, once introduced, does not disappear. It lingers. It grows. It invites further thought. This is the moment where their relationship shifts, not dramatically, not visibly, but undeniably. Because George begins to understand that not every question will have a clear answer. That some truths are layered, complicated, and perhaps intentionally incomplete. And William in turn recognizes that his son is no longer simply accepting what is presented, he is engaging with it, interpreting it, quietly forming his own perspective. That realization carries weight, not just as a father, but as someone who understands the long-term implications of that shift. Because what George begins to question now will not remain confined to this moment. It will follow him, shape him, influence how he sees not just this situation, but the monarchy as a whole. And once that process begins, it cannot be undone. It can only evolve. What makes it even more powerful is that nothing has been resolved. There is no clear conclusion, no definitive answer that closes the conversation and restores certainty. Instead, there is only a deeper layer of understanding, one that introduces more questions than it answers. And that is where the real tension lies. Not in conflict, not in confrontation, but in the quiet continuation of something unresolved. Because the monarchy has always relied on clarity in its outward image, strength, stability, continuity. But within, moments like this reveal something far more complex. A system that carries its past forward, even when that past has not been fully reconciled. A system where silence can speak louder than explanation, and where the next generation begins to feel the weight of what has been left unsaid. And perhaps that is the most significant shift of all. Not what was spoken in that moment, but what was understood without being said. The recognition that beneath the structure, beneath the tradition, beneath the carefully maintained narrative, there are questions that remain open. Questions that may one day demand more than silence. Because in a family where every detail is controlled, it's often the smallest questions that reveal the biggest truths. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.